Okay, so this video is part 3 of the series. I think this will be the last video. I might do another one to provide additional information, but we'll see. So just as a recap, in part 1 I talked about how the prophecies of Isaiah in Isaiah 19 refer to the leaders of Zoan and Noph, and that due to their foolishness, Egypt collapses. And I explained how Egypt is actually representing the United States. In part 2, we then I then discussed how societies collapse, focusing on wickedness and what wicked leaders do and wicked rulers do. Then we talked about complexity and explained that complexity is an inevitable process in evolution as organisms seek to solve problems. They come up with solutions, and those solutions are more complex than the original problems, and that becomes an iterative process, and over time, more complexity occurs. Then I talked about the collapse of networks, discussed how in certain networks, especially scale-free networks, when major hubs are removed, that's when a system collapses, and that oftentimes, too, the collapse of the system is not noticeable at first due to cascading failures, but over time, as more and more nodes collapse or even hubs collapse, eventually the collapse is inevitable. And then this part is going to be kind of connecting this to current events and the elections and what that means for us. So one of the things we know from history is that wicked and foolish leaders leaders in general shape the trajectory of a nation for good or for bad. And wicked leaders play a major role, and they can shape the trajectory of a nation in many ways, and those can have lasting consequences. And that's apparent in common examples of Mao in China and Stalin and the poverty that occasioned their rule and the policies they implemented. You also see this in Venezuela. You see this in many countries around the world. The leader gets in power, implements policies. Those policies are incorrect, and they're foolish and unwise, and the people suffer. So that's kind of why I'm taking this part to focus on the presidential election and what that means for us. Because unfortunately, in the United States, the president has more power than the Constitution likely intended and the drafters of the Constitution intended. But nevertheless, that's the case. And one of the reasons why the president has a lot of power is due to the administrative state, so regulatory agencies, and those agencies regulate pretty much any sphere of commerce and industry, and those regulations shape the character of those industries and how much they can charge on certain things, on what their products have to meet. And some of that's not, maybe you could argue, not necessarily bad. Maybe automobile standards are a good thing to avoid unsafe cars. But the point is that through the regulatory agencies, the president has a lot of control over how businesses operate. The president also has say over foreign policy and also on immigration, as that is solely in the purview of the federal government. So the type of president we have plays a big role in the prosperity and also the direction our country takes. So going back in time, let's go to the 1970s, and there was a president named Jimmy Carter, who was notoriously bad for many reasons. During his presidency, there was massive stagflation, which is inflation and high employment, and I believe the inflation was actually hyperinflation. So it was worse than it is today. And there was also an issue with oil. I can't remember the full details now, but there was something with there was some embargo, and that led to massive oil shortages, which led to further problems. It affected employment because there wasn't reliable energy, and it was just an absolute mess. So it's happened before in the United States. We've had a president that's presided over a disaster. Fortunately, we got out of it through Reagan and the policies he implemented, and through Paul Volcker of the Fed. But we can always go back. So let's now step into the present, and we have two presidential candidates, Kamala Harris and President Trump. And I want to take this time to now discuss the policies of each of these presidents and their implications, and also connect this to the wider theme of the foolish leaders of Zoan and Noph. Because as we remember, Zoan and Noph represent the political and economic hubs of Egypt, and that would be equally applicable to Washington, D.C. or New York today. So we're going to focus on the political aspect. So I will admit that when it comes to Harris's policies, it's not fully clear what her policies are. She's kind of been a chameleon. Nevertheless, she has had interviews and has made statements about some of the core policies of her administration. One of the first is price controls. So I want to explain the problem with this policy. Now, right now we're dealing with inflation, and to some people might think, oh, well, why can't government just come in and tell people what they can charge? Seems fair. That would tamp down on inflation, and voila, we're all good. The problem, though, is inflation is not something that businesses are just creating for the sake of it. It is a natural response to the economic conditions in society. And in this case, there is a high demand due to influx of money, primarily from unnecessary stimuluses of trillions of dollars, that has, with that money, caused people to want to spend. That is, demand is going up because of the money they've received. And with that, in order for businesses to avoid shortages, they raise their prices. It's just a natural flow. I know some businesses or Democrats are talking about price gouging, but that's not necessarily the case. What businesses are doing are raising and it's a more complicated thing because there's also shareholders and fiduciary duties, and I'm not going to get into that. But the key is that businesses are responding to the natural economic conditions, and with more demand, they naturally raise prices to ensure that there is equilibrium in the market. So when you put a control or a price, like a ceiling on what businesses can charge, it doesn't fix the demand issue. It actually, and it makes things worse because there can be shortages. So if a sedan costs $20,000 and then the government caps the cost at $18,000, more people want to buy the car because it's cheaper, but the businesses or the automaker is not generating the same money for the $20,000, and so the revenues decreased, and therefore they have to find other ways to produce the money or reduce the car in order to, but still generate a profit and not go under. And so this can result in businesses laying off workers. And, going back to Jimmy Carter, and I think it was actually Nixon who presided over it, but there was price controls in the 70s. And this was one of the reasons why there was high unemployment, because businesses couldn't hire more employees because they weren't generating enough revenue to support those employees because they had to charge a certain price. And so this is where price controls will lead. It will lead to shortages because businesses don't have the money to produce the commodity at the rate that they normally would because they don't have as much money. Also shortages because there's not enough employees. It could also lead to, outsourcing those jobs because businesses have to find some way to produce a car that is now $18. Well, that a car that is worth $20, and maybe that and the cost that went into that $20,000 car, now I have to sell it 18,000, which they can't do. And so with that, there is one of the biggest things with price controls is shortages, and that leads to a host of problems such as employment and so forth. Another thing is because businesses are generating less revenue, but the cost for producing the car is still the same. That is the labor cost and so forth, buying the materials. One of the other problems that businesses will face is that they'll have less money to devote to research and development, which is innovation, and they'll have less money to devote to their assets, which is an important way that businesses generate profit is investing in capital, right? Machinery and technology, whatever of any kind. I'm thinking mostly of auto right now, I guess, because I'm looking at this picture. But in any form of business, there's certain type of capital that's used to produce a product, and with less money, there's less investment in the capital, and it's usually then becomes older, and then efficiency goes down, and it just becomes this cascading effect that creates problems. And as I indicate here, you'll have companies going bankrupt because they can't afford it. You also, if when it comes to pharmaceutical, if pharmaceutical companies are capped at what they can charge, then they have less money for research and development, and the quality of drugs goes down. So there are major implications with this price control, and I'm quite sure that even liberal economists agree this is a bad idea. So this is one consensus among economists of all partisan or ideologies that price controls are a bad idea. But that's just one bad idea out of many. Another is unrealized capital gains. So this would actually create more inflation because it would decrease profits even more and encourage businesses to generate revenue by other means. Services would be more expensive, and the reason being is because now businesses are being taxed from, well, one of the things that's hard is how you would even measure that. But even if you could, that means businesses have less revenue than they normally did. And so this goes back to the same idea. If they have less revenue, they have to find other ways to cut costs. It's just the way it is. They have to, in order to make a profit, which they need to, or otherwise they can't stay in business, they have to cut costs in other ways. And as a result, the other thing businesses could do, so they could cut costs, that's one way. And the other way that a business could create revenue is through raising prices. Now, if there's price controls, that gets a big problem. And I don't really know. I'm not sure a business would be able to survive in that kind of market when they're being taxed further their revenue, and they also can't raise their prices to be more competitive or to generate revenue in other ways. And also, this would lead to increased insurance rates for the same reason. If insurance companies were taxed unrealized gains, they have to find another way to increase the revenue because insurance companies have fiduciary obligation to ensure that they're solvent, and they also owe it to the shareholders. So what would they do there if their unrealized capital gains are taxed? They have to raise rates. That's the only way that they can meet their obligation to their shareholders and also ensure that people's policies are covered. Or what they would do is create more exclusions, more ways of avoiding paying out, or they'll just not cover certain areas. They might just, when it comes to natural disasters, home insurance might just go away because it's too risky. They can't afford it, and they don't have enough money to do so. And so now you have a whole area of a market that's uninsured, and maybe they insure less businesses. So now you have these businesses operating who are uninsured, and then they get sued, and then the lawsuit demands, X amount of money. The businesses have to self-insure themselves, and they have to pay that as well. And that's the other thing to keep in mind too, is businesses are managing all these other risks, and so they have to manage that, and as well find ways to generate revenue. We also know that she wants to give $25,000 to new home buyers. All that would do is simply increase the cost of a new home to $25,000 because, as we talked about before, if you have new home buyers of $25,000, they have more money than others, and that will incentivize the seller to raise their price because there is additional $25,000 for a new home buyer in the market. So that would, I mean, and that's just what sellers would rationally do. If someone has more money and they're willing to pay more for a good, the rational thing for the seller is to raise the price, and that won't change anything. The other thing is she wants to bargain with drug makers. Again, so this is basically price control all over again, saying, hey, you need to charge this amount. Again, that will just shift the cost to consumers in other ways, or they'll have less money to invest in research and development. Another thing I don't have included on here, but she wants to increase spending. She wants to build more houses. That's going to come from taxes. It's just going to create the debt, and it's also going to be highly expensive to coordinate all the different home builders to build these houses, especially and it will also likely cause prices to go up, supplies to go up, demand to go up, which will cause supply prices to go up for the supplies because there'll be all this new home building. But there's a question of whether the supplies will be able to match up with demand of all those home builders. And she wants to increase child tax credit. That will lead to more inflation again because there's more money in your pocket and more money, higher demand, and that affects supply. The other thing that's a really concern with her policies is her energy. She wants to push reliable clean energy, but that's a myth. There's no such thing. Green energy is not reliable. The main types of energy, I mean, there are hydro plants and hydropower, but that is limited to geography. If you're not near any water source, major water source, that's not going to work. So it's really wind and solar. But wind depends on if there's wind, and solar depends if there's daylight. If you don't have that, then you can't rely on it. And that's a big problem because businesses need to rely on energy to produce. That's how we function. I mean, energy is everywhere in our society. We have it from offices, powering your computers, powering your office space, the buildings, producers of goods, having machines, transporting the goods. As you can see, all of that is interconnected, and this goes back to the idea of networks. All of this is interconnected, and once one of those things goes, everything else will fall. If we don't have reliable energy, guarantee you things will become a lot more expensive. We won't have the same type of goods, and our lives will be radically different. And so this is all kind of interconnected into this whole web, and energy plays a big role. And one of the things which probably Harris will still implement is under the Biden administration, although Biden said that they are increasing the drilling, a lot of this is tapping into the emergency fund, which is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And the problem, though, is that reserve is for emergencies. So if you're tapping into that and you're not replenishing, which I believe they're not, then when you need it in emergencies, such as war, you don't have it. But the other thing, too, is that because of Biden administration's policies regarding oil and the messaging, companies are less likely to invest in oil because it's a very costly thing to invest in digging a new well for oil. It's a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort. And if there is uncertainty, there's going to be less businesses investing. And so that's my understanding is Biden's messaging has created uncertainty in the marketplace and less oil companies are willing to invest. And I don't have any indication that Kamala Harris will change her policy regarding that. So then we have that issue. And again, she's pushed for clean energy, but that's just a myth. So those are where you start to see how a society can collapse with these policies. And this is just a few. I'm not even naming the other ones she has. Now, going to Trump's policy, that should be policy. Going to Trump's policy implications, there are some good and there are some bad. Now, to be very clear, Trump is the best candidate we have, but he's the best candidate we have. He's not ideal. There are definitely some concerns. Nevertheless, there are some good things that he would implement that could at least stem off the chaos from completely oversurging and overflowing our nation. One of the big ways is cutting restrictive regulations. Again, regulations, a lot of money, a lot of companies go in, a lot of costs are sunk into compliance with regulations. That comes with lawyers who are paid to go through the regulation, ensure compliance, or any other compliance type personnel. Might not necessarily be lawyers, but anyways, it's someone who is just paid to go through and ensure that a company is compliant with regulations. That also gives an unfair advantage to major corporations because they have the money to invest in that, where a small business who's starting up doesn't. Another thing is that, so it favors large corporations and it reduces the possibility or the likelihood of small businesses flourishing. But it also, again, takes costs. It takes money away from what businesses could use to generate profit or to cut costs. They have to, because they had more money, then they could say, we have more money, we don't need to charge as much, we can reduce the cost. But with regulations and cumbersome regulations, requires paying a lot of money to ensure that they're compliant. And if they're not, then they get fined or they have to do an adjudicative proceeding through an administrative level and hire lawyers, and it's just a mess. And that's just money that's being wasted instead of being invested into the business, or that can be used to lower costs for the consumer. So cutting regulations, and it would also, if Trump cut regulations significantly, that could free up businesses, free up how much, give businesses more money that they then could maybe lower the price for a good, and they could also invest again. So that would be a way, and also a way to reduce inflation. Another thing, and I'll talk more about this in another post, is managing illegal immigration. Illegal immigration is at an all-time high, and importantly, there are more criminals coming in than previously before, from my understanding, and many of those criminals have been released and they are not detained. So we have ex-cons just been entered the United States, and we don't know where they are. And some of these have been, or a lot, I think it was like 10,000 I saw, have been convicted of sexual assault and other violent crimes. So this becomes an issue because if there becomes a recession, then you have more people competing for jobs, but now you also have illegal immigrants competing, and that could create a bottleneck of who's get hired, and that could lead to further unemployment and further problems. And so addressing illegal immigration is an important thing, and I will explain this more in another post, and it has actually huge implications for the end times, and that will be explained later. As I mentioned before with Kamala Harris, there is the energy independence. That is really important to return to fossil fuels. And I kind of want to talk more about that. As I said before, energy is central to the economy. We rely on electricity, rely on fossil fuels, and people don't realize that our electricity is produced by fossil fuels because we need heat to power the turbines. And that heat comes from fossil fuels. That gets burned, the heat gets burned, and then it powers the turbines. The turbines then generate electricity, which then powers our homes. So when you use electric energy, you're still using fossil fuels mostly. I mean, maybe you're using some geothermal if you're in Iceland, or hydropower in some other place, but most people are still using fossil fuels. So when you charge your electric car, you're not all of a sudden going completely green because you're still relying on fossil fuels to get that energy. And my understanding is that the clean energy we have right now cannot produce the power that fossil fuel energy is producing. And I'll get more into that later. So clean energy just cannot compete with fossil fuels. And One of the reasons is that fossil fuels have greater energy density. That means they can generate large amounts of electricity from a compact area. And that's what you see with power plants. I don't know the exact numbers, but what a power plant can produce in terms of energy, solar or wind needs twice or three times as more. That's why you see these photos of solar panels covering all of a mountain. And I don't even believe that those solar panels are producing the same amount of energy as a power plant. So that's one of the things. The other thing is fossil fuels are extremely efficient in terms of energy. They convert 60% of energy, where clean energy such as solar and wind is about 15 to 22. Wind is 45%. So there's a lot of energy that's lost. And as I talked about before, fossil fuels are very reliable. You can generate energy around the clock, whereas with clean energy, it depends a lot on the daylight and weather. And if it's hydropowered, it depends on geography. So if you don't live near a dam, then, well, you're not going to be able to use that energy, and tough luck. So those are very important things. And there's also education reform, and certainly less government involved in education would be helpful, especially when it comes to the type of policies that the federal government is requiring that schools implement in order to receive grants and funding, such as critical race theory and gender affirming teachings. And so those also become problems as well. But again, Trump's not perfect. Additional tax cuts without cutting spending is a recipe for more debt. Um, there is concern of him centralizing executive power more than probably is helpful. A new Obamacare would not really do much because Obamacare itself was a problem. It um, caused rates to rise because insurance companies had to cover more risky individuals, and in order to cover those risky individuals, they had to raise the rates to offset the risk. And so Obamacare actually made rates go up, and it's not really sure what type of program Trump could enact that would not be like Obamacare, unless you want to do a government option, but that would be massively expensive. And as you just look at England, government doesn't have the same incentives to innovate, and they're not as flexible. They're rigid. You just won't get good healthcare. So I don't know what Trump's going to do on that. And as I said before, he's not cutting government spending, so that's also a concern. Um, Immigration is another issue. We'll talk about that later. So the way to really get out of our morass is to reduce the amount of direct democracy, reduce the size of government, cut all entitlement programs, focus on fossil fuels and nuclear energy that are reliable, stripping away regulations, focus on merit, and then, of course, nationwide repentance. Now, one of the things about direct democracy is I know we think democracy should be for all 18-year-olds, but there becomes a problem with that kind of view, and we start to see it now when people vote on a president because they like the president or for whatever arbitrary reasons instead of the actual policies that are being suggested. And when voting in the founding era, it was you had to be 18-year-old and landowning. And there's a reason for that. And it's actually more wise than we realize, is because 18-year-olds who were landowning had a sense of how things worked, and therefore they could analyze the issues with a rational sense. And they weren't motivated and swayed by emotion, as is most of our democratic elections. A lot of it is emotion based instead of reason, instead of policy. Most politicians shy away from getting wonky on policy because most Americans would not be able to understand it, and they would turn off. And so instead, it turns into just passions and emotion, because now that we've given the vote to every 18-year-old, well, most 18-year-olds are not that smart. And I mean, most Americans are not that intelligent. If you just look at, the bell curve of IQ, which is 100, I mean, that's the average. So you got a lot of problems there when the majority of the populace isn't educated enough to understand complex issues. So another thing with just direct democracy, something to consider is that in the founding era, and it was, I can't remember when it was changed, but the Senate used to be elected by the state legislator, and that was another important mechanism in place to create a buffer between the populace and the more, I guess, educated elites. And because those who were, instead of us directly electing senators, and most of us are not very smart, kind of stupid, um, instead of that happening, you would have, generally, if you're a state legislator, you have some level of intelligence, some level of skill that you would know and understand policy that you would then appoint and vote on a senator that was knowledgeable. And so when you have the people voting, it just becomes voting for senators. It just becomes what the people feel are best. But when you had it with by the election by a state legislator, you had this buffer and you had this time for deliberation, and the state legislators would likely and presumably consider the senator and the policy proposals and then vote based on that instead of on whether they like the person. And so that would have allowed the legislator, at least the senators, to be elected representatives who were most qualified for that position. The Senate still kind of has that because you only get 2 senators for each state, but it's not the same as it was before because those people, senators, are still being elected by the people, and they have to kind of dumb down their message to appeal to the wide mass of the populace. And so that's another problem, and that's led to further problems with policy proposals and things of that nature. Another thing that could really help is focus on merit, because we want people who are the most competent to be in positions of power. Placing people in such positions leads to prosperity and benefits everyone else. For example, you had Steve Jobs at Apple. He was an innovator. His innovations had led to a better product. And if we just had someone in his position because of his gender or race, it's not sure you get the same product, right? This also goes to what I've talked about earlier with airline pilots. We want the best pilots flying planes, especially as planes become more complicated. Same with doctors. We want doctors who are the most qualified operating on us and treating us. So those are some of the things to kind of think about. But likely this isn't going to happen. Again, society is thoroughly wicked, and more so, it's not even, well, it's wicked, but it's progressed to a point where it's not ripe iniquity. It's very close to being a ripe iniquity because we have so many false beliefs that have been embedded into every institution of society that there's really no way of getting from that. And people have been so enculturated into false beliefs about how things work and about how they perceive the role of government, that the government's there to just make their lives easier, that getting them to want a more limited government, which would mean they take more accountability and responsibility, is not going to be an easy sell. So that's one of the things. It's also any calamity isn't really going to bring our country together. It's just tear us apart. Another problem: politicians are interested in votes and not what's good for the country. Generally speaking, there are some good politicians, but a lot of it is just what can they say to get elected. And so oftentimes they will promise everything, even things that are not helpful. So that's another reason why direct democracy is not always the best, because you have politicians who are pushing for harmful policies because they can get elected. And so they don't have the best interest of us in mind. They just have what's politically expedient. Another issue is people are not willing to sacrifice, not willing to repent. And then we also just have a lower IQ. Some studies have found that IQ of verbal reasoning, matrix reasoning, which is visual problem solving, has dropped. And there is some sign that in that regard, Americans are getting dumber. So what we have is we have a more complex system, and this inverse relationship. We have a more complex system, but we have people who are not able. At the same time, it's getting more complex. We're getting dumber on average, and not able to. And so there's a mismatch, and the complexity is overwhelming. So what this means, well, it kind of depends on the outcome of the election. I'm not saying that Trump is going to be a panacea to everything, but if Trump does not win, then you can prepare for hyperinflation, food shortages, reduction in innovation, persecution, collapse, famine, pestilence, and all the other things listed here, which are the natural consequences of a collapsing society. Now, I'm not saying that even if Trump gets in, these things will be avoided. It just might not be as heightened. But certainly, given the policy implications of Kamala Harris, and as I discussed, these will be the natural result. And this is what we have to look forward to. And so when it comes to November 15th and voting, keep these in mind. Think hard about who you want to be in power and think hard about the implications, because we are definitely stepping into biblical prophecy, and the things that have been foretold will happen. And again, as I've said, this is not any intellectual exercise. This is merely to point out in more particularity and explain how current policies will lead us into the same state and condition of the princes of Zoan and Noph and those consequences that follow.